History rarely makes room for outsiders, especially in the grand narratives of empires, kings, and dynasties. Those born far from the center of power are often reduced to footnotes, if they're remembered at all. Malik Ambar was one such outsider. Born in Ethiopia, sold into slavery, and shipped across the Indian Ocean, he should have vanished into anonymity. Instead, he rose to become one of the most powerful figures in 17th century India, a military genius, a political strategist, and the de facto ruler of the Ahmadnagar Sultanate in the Deccan region. Malik Ambar wasn't a king by title, but he made kings, dethroned them, and ruled from the shadows with intelligence, diplomacy, and iron will. To many, he was a savior, a man who resisted the vast and ever-growing Mughal Empire with guerrilla tactics that confounded even Emperor Jahangir. To others, especially his enemies, he was a problem that refused to go away. An African man commanding Indian armies, rewriting the rules of power, and building cities that would last centuries. That wasn't supposed to happen, and yet, it did. This is the story of how a man ripped from his homeland not only survived, but shaped the political landscape of a subcontinent. It's a story of resilience, rebellion, and reinvention. From the slave markets of Arabia to the battlefield strategies of the Deccan, Malik Ambar's life defies simple categorization. He was not just a soldier. He was an administrator, a builder, a scholar, and above all, a disruptor of empires. To understand Malik Ambar is to challenge how we think about race, migration, power, and historical memory. Because while he left a visible mark on the land he ruled, his legacy, like that of so many African figures in Asian history, has too often been hidden, buried under the sands of empire. Today, we uncover it. Malik Ambar was born around 1548 in the region of Harar, in what is now eastern Ethiopia. His birth name may have been Chapu, though records differ, and much of his early life remains shrouded in mystery. What is clear, however, is that he was of Oromo descent, a Cushitic-speaking ethnic group with a deep cultural history and long-standing presence in the Horn of Africa. At some point in his youth, Chapu was captured, either through intertribal conflict, raiding, or a regional slave trade, and sold into bondage. He was eventually taken across the Red Sea, through the port cities of Yemen, and into the Gulf. From there, he was sold again, likely in the bustling slave markets of Baghdad or Basra, before being purchased by an Indian merchant or noble. By the time he arrived in India, he was still young, probably in his early teens, but his life was about to change dramatically. Purchased by Chengiz Khan, a prominent noble in the Deccan region who himself had risen from African slave origins, Chapu was renamed Ambar and trained in military tactics, administration, and courtly politics. In a rare stroke of fate, he was not only educated, he was elevated. Chengiz Khan recognized Ambar's intelligence and drive. When Chengiz died, Ambar was freed, becoming a Mamluk, a military slave turned free warrior. From here, he took the name Malik Ambar, Malik being an Arabic title denoting leadership or chieftainship. It was more than a name change. It was a redefinition of identity. Ambar's journey from Harar to the Deccan reflects a rarely acknowledged chapter of global history, the East African diaspora into the Islamic and South Asian worlds. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, where freedom was rarely granted and social mobility was almost non-existent, the Indian Ocean world allowed for more complex trajectories. In Ambar's case, he transformed that complexity into command. He was no longer a slave. He was a strategist, and soon he would become a kingmaker. 3. The rise of a military genius. Once freed, Malik Ambar didn't seek the safety of obscurity. Instead, he entered the turbulent world of Deccan politics, a region of fragmented sultanates, rival warlords, and encroaching imperial forces. The late 16th century was a volatile time in India's Deccan Plateau. The once mighty Bahmani Sultanate had fractured into 5 successor states, all jostling for dominance while the Mughal Empire loomed steadily from the north. Ambar, ever the tactician, began his career by joining local mercenary forces, but he quickly distinguished himself. not just through martial skill, but through strategy, adaptability, and charisma. He began assembling his own band of loyal troops, many of whom were fellow Africans, as well as indigenous Maratha warriors. This multi-ethnic, multi-religious force would become the core of his power. By the 1590s, Malik Ambar had become one of the most sought-after generals in the Deccan. When internal strife threatened the Ahmadnagar Sultanate, he stepped into the vacuum. Though he never claimed the throne, he installed puppet sultans, effectively controlling the state as its regent. He reorganized the military, introduced a standing army with structured pay, and developed innovative tactics, including hit-and-run warfare and coordinated cavalry attacks, that would later be adopted by the Marathas. But his genius wasn't limited to the battlefield. He also instituted an efficient revenue system based on land surveys, drawing inspiration from the Mughal model, but modifying it to suit local needs. He built fortifications, encouraged settlement, and actively protected local farmers from both warlords and imperial tax collectors. Perhaps his greatest military achievement was his decades-long resistance to the Mughal Empire. Under Emperor Akbar and his son Jahangir, the Mughals threw vast resources at the Deccan, determined to conquer the region. Yet Malik Ambar held them off, again and again. His use of mobile warfare, knowledge of the terrain, and alliances with Maratha chieftains allowed him to harass and outmaneuver numerically superior forces. Jahangir hated him with a personal passion, once commissioning a painting of himself shooting an arrow into Ambar's decapitated head, an artistic fantasy that betrayed just how maddening the African general had become to the imperial court. But Malik Ambar wasn't just surviving, he was winning. Malik Ambar was not just a warrior or a regent, he was a planner, an urban visionary, and an architect of policy. While he's often remembered for his military resistance to the Mughals, one of his most enduring achievements lies in something far less dramatic, but arguably more impactful: the founding and construction of Khatki, a new capital city near present-day Aurangabad. In the early 17th century, Ambar sought to move his administrative center away from the increasingly unstable power structures of Ahmadnagar. He chose a fertile, defensible location and began designing a city that would reflect both military necessity and administrative efficiency. This city, Khatki, was not a symbolic capital. It was a functional, working political hub with fortifications, water systems, markets, military encampments, and a cosmopolitan population of soldiers, artisans, farmers, and merchants. One of his most brilliant contributions was the creation of the Nehar system, a sophisticated canal network that brought water from surrounding mountains into the heart of the city. Using principles of Persian and Central Asian water engineering, Ambar commissioned the construction of aqueducts, reservoirs, and underground channels that allowed Khatki to flourish even during dry seasons. This infrastructure supported agriculture, supplied drinking water, and sustained the military, solidifying the city as a viable power center. Malik Ambar also reformed land taxation in ways that protected peasant farmers and ensured state revenue. Instead of relying on exploitative middlemen or corrupt aristocrats, he implemented a system that directly assessed agricultural output and levied proportional taxes. This wasn't merely benevolence, it was statecraft. By empowering farmers and stabilizing food production, Ambar built a loyal rural base that supported his rule long after individual sultans came and went. Khatki thrived under his governance and later became known as Aurangabad, under the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, who recognized its strategic importance. The irony? Aurangzeb expanded and beautified a city founded by the very man whose tactics had once thwarted his imperial ambitions. Malik Ambar's vision for governance was rooted in realism. He understood that no military could survive without food, water, and public order, so he built those into his power base. In doing so, he not only held off the greatest empire of the time, he proved that a man once enslaved could govern more effectively than those born into thrones. If Malik Ambar was skilled with the sword, he was perhaps even more masterful with the quill. While warfare defined much of his public image, it was his diplomacy and political strategy that allowed him to outlast rivals, suppress rebellions, and maintain de facto control over the Ahmadnagar Sultanate for decades. Navigating the Deccan in the early 1600s required more than courage. It required an almost supernatural ability to read shifting loyalties. The region was a mosaic of feuding sultanates: Bijapur, Golconda, Berar, and Ahmadnagar, each with their own agendas and vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, the Marathas were rising as a formidable regional force, and the Mughals were encroaching from the north with their immense resources and imperial ambitions. Malik Ambar walked this tightrope with astonishing precision. He formed strategic alliances with Maratha chiefs, most notably Maloji Bhosale, the grandfather of Shivaji, who would later establish the Maratha Empire. Ambar's early recognition of the Marathas' potential and his willingness to give them military roles laid groundwork for a future alliance system that would outlive him and eventually challenge Mughal rule on a far larger scale. It also played his enemies against one another. When Golconda threatened Ahmadnagar, Ambar struck temporary peace deals with Bijapur. When the Mughals offered truces, he accepted, but only long enough to regroup and strike elsewhere. He understood the art of delay, misdirection, and strategic silence. His battlefield victories were impressive, but his political survival in such a fractious, high-stakes environment was a feat of mental endurance. But diplomacy wasn't limited to inter-sultanate politics. Malik Ambar also managed complex relationships with foreign traders and Persian bureaucrats. He welcomed skilled workers from Iran and Central Asia, incorporated African officers into high-ranking military roles, and maintained a court that was not only multi-ethnic but intellectually vibrant. He encouraged poetry, Persian scholarship, and administrative record-keeping, tools that gave his governance legitimacy and depth. By the time he reached the height of his power, Ambar controlled appointments to court positions, dictated military campaigns, and even selected puppet rulers to sit on the Ahmadnagar throne. He was the engine, the strategist, and the real voice of the state. But what makes this remarkable isn't just that he did these things. It's that he did them without ever calling himself king. That restraint was not humility. It was calculation. To call himself king would have united his enemies against him, but to operate as the power behind the throne, that was brilliance. And that's why history remembers him not just as a general, but as a kingmaker. Malik Ambar remained in power well into his 70s, a remarkable feat for anyone in the brutal political climate of 17th century India, let alone a man who had entered that world through slavery. Into his old age, he continued to lead armies, negotiate alliances, and shape the Ahmadnagar Sultanate's foreign policy as if it were his personal dominion. He had become, in effect, the stabilizing core of a state that might otherwise have collapsed under the weight of Mughal pressure and internal division. Despite increasing age, he never truly slowed down. He launched his final significant military campaign in 1624, dealing yet another blow to Mughal ambitions in the Deccan. His strategy remained mobile and elusive. He would never meet the imperial army head-on, but would instead attack their supply lines, cut off reinforcements, and vanish into terrain his troops knew like the back of their hands. It was warfare by erosion, not by spectacle. And it worked. In 1626, Malik Ambar died peacefully, likely from natural causes. At the time of his death, he was arguably the most powerful figure in southern India who did not claim a throne. His military innovations had created a model that the Marathas would later adapt and perfect. His revenue system sustained a kingdom. His city of Khadki had grown into a major urban center, and his enemies, especially the Mughals, had failed to conquer him in life. But with his death, the House of Cards began to tremble. His son, Fateh Khan, lacked his father's strategic mind and political judgment. Mughal pressure intensified. Without Malik Ambar's steady hand, Ahmadnagar eventually fell. The Mughals would go on to conquer large parts of the Deccan, but even they would later struggle against the very forces Ambar had helped cultivate: guerrilla tactics, decentralized resistance, and alliances among regional powers. Still, Malik Ambar's direct legacy didn't die with his kingdom. It echoed in the rise of Shivaji and the Maratha Empire. It lived on in the Nehir canal systems of Aurangabad, and it persisted in oral histories and folklore throughout both Ethiopia and India. Stories of a dark-skinned man from Africa who bent empires to his will with nothing but his mind and a sword. So why isn't Malik Ambar a household name? The reasons are layered, and they reveal a great deal about how history is curated, and by whom. For centuries, colonial historians and European scholars largely ignored African figures in Asian history. Malik Ambar, despite commanding armies and reshaping economies, didn't fit the narrative they preferred, that Africa's historical contributions were limited to the margins. His story shattered that illusion, so they minimized him. Even in India, his African origin became a footnote, not a headline. The later Mughal chroniclers, especially those writing under Jahangir, painted him as a meddlesome upstart, a nuisance who complicated the righteous march of imperial expansion. Jahangir's famously petty painting of himself executing Ambar in effigy speaks volumes. This wasn't just propaganda, it was an attempt at narrative assassination. Ambar, even in death, was a threat to the official story. And then there is race. Malik Ambar's skin color was unambiguous, and for centuries that too made him a historical anomaly. He was a black man ruling in South Asia, commanding respect, dictating strategy, and building cities. Not as a token, not as a servant, but as the central force of a region. That didn't sit comfortably with many historians trained in Eurocentric or caste-centric traditions. And so, slowly, he was edited out of the spotlight. But in recent years, that silence has begun to crack. Ethiopian scholars, Afro-Asian historians, and new voices in global history are reclaiming Malik Ambar's story, not just as a curiosity, but as a foundational example of what diaspora, resilience, and ambition can achieve. His life challenges the idea that history flows only through thrones and dynasties. It shows us that the margins are often where the most revolutionary stories begin. Malik Ambar's life defies categorization. He was not a king, but he ruled. He was not born into privilege, but he shaped empires. He did not belong to the land he governed by birthright, but he made it his own through vision, strategy, and sheer willpower. He is a figure who, if we take him seriously, forces us to rethink what we mean by power, origin, and greatness. In an era defined by conquest and consolidation, Malik Ambar stood as a living contradiction. He was an African, a Muslim, a former slave, and a master tactician in a world that expected none of those things to coexist. And yet, they did. His story reminds us that history is never as neat or hierarchical as textbooks would have us believe. Sometimes, the most important players aren't those born into palaces, but those who claw their way up from the bottom, rewriting the game as they go. Malik Ambar didn't just survive. He ruled, he innovated, and he disrupted the greatest empire of his day. And for that, he deserves not just remembrance, but reverence. Let history finally catch up.